After dealing with so many monsters after coming to this world, it was surprising to see humans, especially when standing there, seeming to be some sort of honor guard, just staring at me. And I just stared right back. Now remember, I'm still in my gear with a full gas mask on. I walked slowly as my brother tried to grab my arm, telling me to stop. I walked up to the gate deliberately and slow. I did not hold my hands out to show that I'm unarmed. In fact, I held that crossbow tight in my hands. I waited around the bodies of monsters and walked right up to him, looked him in the eyes, and he was trying to keep his composure. This man was dressed in old plate armor. He looked a little bit like a conquistador since it was basically just a chest plate, though he wasn't wearing that weird helmet. Instead, it was similar to the old World War II pickle helm, without the spike, though. His clothes were rugged, designed for hard work. This was true for his boots and gloves as well. His subordinates were dressed similarly and carried musket-type weapons that didn't look very clean. In fact, it looked like they had not changed their clothes in at least a week. The subordinates were clearly nervous at the sight of me, even though I didn't move an inch. One of them whispered to the one in charge and received an answer in a language, again, I just didn't understand, but it wasn't the same that the elves use. It wasn't Spanish, I can tell you that. I'm thinking about it a little, and it seemed almost like Hindu, of all things, though with an obviously slang to its words. The one in charge then walked up to the cell door and spoke. I had still no idea what he was saying. I am many things, but a linguist is not one of them. I spoke saying, I do not know your language, though I have a feeling you are the one who captured these folks. With that, I mentioned the elves and motioned to them over to my right and left. When I looked, they began to cower in fear. Not just fear, but terror from looking at this man. This made my blood boil as I turned back. I must have moved in a way that was threatening because one of his subordinates leveled his weapon and fired. The ball hit me near the heart. The force was such a large object striking my plate set me off my feet and backwards down the short staircase I was standing on. Just 4 small steps, but enough to make the landing hurt a whole lot more than it had to. As I rolled to a stop at the bottom, I tried not to move as I did a quick mental assessment. It was clear that if my ribs weren't broken, they had taken far more damage than I wanted to think they did. I was in so much pain that I didn't even want to move, even though I could. Thinking for a few seconds, I could tell that the ball had not penetrated my vest. Thank God for small miracles. After a few moments, I could hear them laughing, the guards that is. Then a few seconds went by before I could hear my little brother call my name. This was enough to get me up out of my stupor. Sitting up, I looked at the 3 still standing in the doorway. The leader had some keys in his hands, perhaps about to open the door, when he looked up in shock and began to see me find my feet. His first subordinates began to reload, and I could see that the second one tried to ready his weapon. Painfully, I reached for the crossbow. A quick look revealed that it still had a bolt, so I leveled it off as the second subordinate tried to draw a bead on me, but I was just a little faster. The bolt pierced his eye, and he dropped his firearm. It hit the ground with the muzzle first and misfired. The firearm bounced up and hit the ceiling, coming back down in a cloud of white smoke. This was enough for the remaining 2 to nope the hell out of there. They ran up the staircase screaming, and we guessed for reinforcements. I fell back down on my ass as I tried to get some air back in my lungs. Thankfully, my friend got to me to check me out. Though his medical supplies were almost completely depleted, he could simply use what was left over of my IFAK, my personal individual first aid kit, to patch me up. My big brother showed up and was saying something to me. I began to freak out when I couldn't hear anything. That was the moment when I realized that concussion of the muzzleloader had rendered me temporarily deaf. I could hear a high tone as my friend was checking me for a concussion. Getting my wits back, I waved them both off and tried to get to my feet. Not so easy, but eventually some of the elves came over to help. We began to head back to the mirror when I noticed a few of the elves were slowly making their way to it. It was clear they thought this might be a way out. Trying to yell, I had to resort to hand signals to get them back away from the mirror. Had to be careful. For all we knew, our atmosphere would be toxic, and Lord knows what humans would do if they suddenly saw elves in our world. As I got my hearing back, my brother told me what he couldn't say before. We couldn't stay. There was no way out. No way to get the elves out without facing whatever was above us. I agreed, but to me and my friend, we just couldn't leave the mission incomplete. We had to figure something out. My little brother was freaking out, saying if we don't leave, they could come back with a shitload of guns and take us all out. I love it when the obvious escapes you, don't you? My friend and I looked at each other and began to laugh. We had realized that our fears were not founded. Firearms would not cause an explosion, result that we had feared would happen from all the methane in the air. At this point, 2 black powder muskets had been fired with no resulting explosion. We talked for a bit and realized the first thing we needed was to get water, food, and clothing. I sent my brothers back through the mirror to get as many water jugs as they could find. Also, they would have to go back to my place and get the emergency food. For a group this large, it would only be good for 1-2 meals, maybe, though it was better than nothing. The water started coming through within a few minutes. My brother had the idea of grabbing an old wash tub and filling it with the hose from the outside. Luckily, it reached through the mirror. We found some non-glass cups, and the elves began to slam down as much water as they could. We tried to tell them to slow down, even tried hand signals to get them to not overfill with water too fast. They noticed, but didn't slow down until the first few started to vomit from drinking too much too fast. We were able to get them to slow down at that point, and everyone eventually received their fill. Unfortunately, sometimes it just isn't enough. A few more of the injured passed, and we tried to give them water. We tried IV fluids, but nothing. We moved them into their own cell. Guess we made it a makeshift morgue for now. With each one lost, my rage began to fuel even more. My friend had to calm me down every so often since he had seen that look in my eyes before. I took his word to heart, but I needed to stay angry. I work better that way. At this point, it was the only thing keeping me on my feet. That was when I saw something that defied science to the core. We gathered around one of the fallen, and there was a shimmer coming from their bodies as they reached out. I didn't know how to explain it, except between the body and the elves, their hands was like a distortion you get when looking at a hot road in the summer from a distance. It wasn't even the weirdest part. The dead child started coughing. They were alive, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Simultaneously, my friend and I said, "What the fuck?" as we watched. This wasn't until one of the adults fell over. We ran to him and checked his vitals. He was alive, but incredibly weak. Then 2 more fell over, and we started yelling at the remainder to stop, and thankfully they did. The elves picked up the 3 that had passed out and brought them over to the water. They kept trying to get them to drink, and other elves did the same strange magic thing with the other fallen elves. Couldn't watch for too long as we could hear armored footfalls in the stairway. This time, I didn't bother with a crossbow, and I pulled the rifle off my back. As I did, I was so happy that I spent the money on the sound suppressor for it. For those that don't know, a suppressor drowns the sound, doesn't make the bullet go slower, but it's definitely not like the movies. It's not that loud. Instead, it simply lowers the volume to the point where it doesn't cause permanent damage to your ears when you fire it. It was still really loud, especially in an enclosed area like this. From my location, I couldn't get a good shot at the door. As I moved around, I could see some of them trying to open the door as fast as possible. My guess was that it was a platoon-sized element, or maybe better, behind them just biting for the chance to charge in. As the door opened, I was able to see a couple to make it in. I raised my rifle and heard several shots, but not mine. My friend was the one with the worst PTSD I've ever seen. He had drawn his 9mm Beretta and dropped the first few where they stood. The elves ran for cover, holding their ears, as I got a good sight picture and began to take out the ones with the firearms first. Now, I know the state doesn't like it when you have a standard capacity third round magazine, but it allowed me to make sure none of them got in. Only after a few seconds of them trying to rush had they stopped trying to enter. The ones that had entered were either not moving or moaning in pain. My friend and I stood there, weapons up, staring at the door, and that's when we saw something we were not expecting to see. A piece of white cloth being waved at the end of a stick. It stuck out from the side of the door and waved for about 10 seconds. My friend and I looked at each other for a second and lowered our weapons, if only slightly. I noticed the pistol shaking in his hands as he kept a death grip on it. I walked over to him and put my hand on his shoulder. With a look and a hand motion, I got him back to the mirror. As he backed away, the original guard from earlier walked into view. He held that makeshift white flag in one hand, and the other was simply raised high. He stood at the doorway, and we looked at each other eye to eye for just a few moments. He then motioned to his men. I simply moved my head to the left, signaling, "Go get them." He said something to the ones behind him, and several came around the corner to help gather his people up who had fallen. I stood stoic as I could until one turned the corner with a firearm in hand. In a moment, I raised my rifle and shot the musket. At that range, you don't miss. Everyone stood up and raised their hands, at least until the guard leader saw that the younger one had brought a weapon. He began to yell at the younger man until he got close enough to clock him one. I could see, when he turned back to me, that he was trying to apologize. I simply lowered the muzzle of my weapon a little bit to let them collect their people. It is a good thing that I had a mask on, since I didn't want them to see me cracking up over one young guy being so frickin' dumb. When they got the last one out, the leader was locking the door, and I yelled through my mask, "Hey!" He looked up and saw me holding the rifle with one arm, as I was pointing to the keys with the other. I motioned for him to drop them, but instead he tossed them inside. I really didn't care, since I was just to slow them down if they ever tried to get them back in. When things finally calmed down, I turned back to the mirror. That's when I began to cough. It was difficult to hear me through the protective mask on, but they did see me. What I didn't tell them is I could taste blood. That wasn't good. Apparently, that shot to the torso did more damage than I thought. No time to rest now that I'm on the clock, though. Now, before all this latest excitement, the elves had shown that they could heal their wounded. Best guess was that's why they were in chains when they were first entered the room. From the looks of things, it took a lot out of them to do it, too, so he had to get them fed and fast. As it turns out, luck was on our side in this regard. My brother had come back with all my provisions. In case you were wondering, these are military rations. The majority of them are dehydrated and placed into number 10 cans. There were some MREs, meals rejected by the enemy, and a few civilian containers that were usually 3 months' supply of mostly pasta-type rations. I knew we would have to start a fire and boil water to make much of it edible and slightly palatable. Though for this, I would have to reach into my pocket. Without much wood to burn, we had to shuttle some from the other side of the mirror. But now it was starting to get difficult to keep some of the elves from trying to rush the mirror thinking it was an escape. My little brother handled that with a simple air horn. With the sensitive hearing of the elves, one blast at close range was painful as far as I could tell as pepper spray and open eyes. As we served the food, thankfully my brother had grabbed a bunch of paper plates and bowls when he was getting the food. There seemed to be a definite hierarchy at work. Several of the more discernative elves tried to push their way to the front. Arguing ensued and a few small scuffles over who would eat first. That was until my friend racked his pistol, pulled the slide back, and resting it with a large metallic snap. That they all sudden paid attention to. Via hand signals, he was able to convey that the children would eat first. He was able to get them to line up, get them a plate or bowl, and get their chow in relatively short time. While the food cooked, my big brother noticed something strange. The fire was not burning up. He was noticing that the flames licked one side, showing that there was an air current, some sort of inside this dungeon. If we could figure out where it was coming from, we might have a way out. It isn't like we could just bring them back with us. Before you say, why not, consider that there would be no way to hide them from the general public for very long. And once the governments find out, well, you wouldn't find much more than a hastily made crime scene and some sort of official story over how they all just disappeared. Even worse, they would just Ruby Ridge or Waco us to make it happen. At this point, I was getting too tired to care. I sat down on the other side of the mirror and began to drift off. I was suddenly awakened by a hand shaking my shoulder. In that one motion, I grabbed the hand, twisted it, rolled over on top of the person, and drew my pistol. That is when I snapped back to reality and realized it was just my big brother. My friend was yelling at him, saying, "I told you not to do that! Kick his feet, not shake his shoulder, moron." I holstered my pistol, raised my brother up, and asked, "What the hell is going on?" Standing back up, my big brother said, "I did it! I found the way out!"